By 1943, the Stuka was supposed to be dead, obsolete, vulnerable, a relic of blitzkrieg that had no place in the skies above the Eastern Front. But then, someone had a crazy idea: hang 2 massive cannons under its wings and send it hunting for tanks. The result was the Ju-87G, the Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. And in the hands of one man, it would become the most feared tank killer in the skies, claiming over 500 Soviet armored vehicles in a single year. This is the story of the Ju-87G and how a dying aircraft found new life as a predator of steel. Context: the turning tide. The year was 1943. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare for Germany. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army had been encircled and crushed. At Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history had ended in brutal stalemate. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was bleeding. And at the heart of that bloodletting was Soviet armor. The T-34 medium tank had proven itself a masterpiece. Fast, well-armored, and produced in staggering numbers. Behind it came waves of KV-1 heavy tanks, and soon the monstrous IS-2, with armor thick enough to shrug off most German guns. German panzer divisions found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. For every tank they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. On the ground, German anti-tank crews fought desperately. The legendary 88mm flak gun could punch through Soviet armor, but it was heavy and vulnerable to artillery. Panzerfaust teams had to get suicidally close. Tank destroyers helped, but there were never enough. The Luftwaffe tried to fill the gap. Bf-109s and Fw-190s strafed with cannons, but their fire bounced off tank armor. Bombers dropped high explosives, but hitting a moving tank from altitude was nearly impossible. Even the feared Ju-87 Stuka, the dive bomber that had terrorized Poland and France, was struggling. By 1943, the Stuka was a dying breed. Its fixed landing gear and slow speed made it easy prey for Soviet fighters. Its bombs lacked the penetration to reliably knock out tanks. Entire Stuka units were being mauled by Yak-9s and La-5s. The Germans needed something different, something that could strike Soviet armor from the air with devastating precision. What they needed was not a new aircraft. They needed to reinvent an old one. The weapon: engineering desperation. The idea was born from desperation and audacity in equal measure. Someone asked a simple question: what if we mounted cannons on the Stuka? Not bombs, not rockets. Cannons. The weapon chosen was the 37mm BK 3.7 anti-tank cannon, a modified version of the Flak 18. This was no ordinary aircraft gun. It was a monster designed to punch through armor plate, firing tungsten core rounds that could penetrate over 100 millimeters of steel. 2 of these cannons were slung beneath the Stuka's wings, jutting forward like the tusks of some mechanical predator. Each cannon held a 6-round magazine, 12 shots total, 12 chances to kill. The Ju-87G, officially designated as such, but more commonly called the Kanonenvogel by its crews, became slower, heavier, and even more vulnerable than before. The added weight dragged its already modest speed down further. Maneuverability suffered. This was no longer a dive bomber. It was a low-altitude tank hunter, built to fly slow and strike hard. The cockpit remained cramped, with the pilot sitting high under a greenhouse canopy. Behind him sat the radio operator and rear gunner, armed with a single machine gun, practically useless against the fighters that would inevitably come hunting. But the real firepower was in those cannons. When both fired in unison, the recoil was so violent that pilots described it as if the aircraft had hit an invisible wall. The nose pitched upward. The whole fuselage shuddered. And yet, when those tungsten rounds found their mark, the results were devastating. A direct hit on a tank's thin top armor could punch straight through, igniting ammunition or fuel inside. A T-34 that took a burst from a Kanonenvogel didn't just stop, it erupted. The Ju-87G was ungainly, outdated, and vulnerable, but in the hands of a skilled pilot, it became a scalpel, precise, lethal, and terrifyingly effective. The ace, Hans Ulrich Rudel. If the Ju-87G was a weapon forged from desperation, then Hans Ulrich Rudel was the man who turned it into legend. Rudel did not start as a hero. Early in his training, instructors doubted whether he had the instincts for combat flying. He was stubborn, reckless, and obsessed with proving himself. But once he climbed into a Stuka, something changed. By 1943, Rudel had already flown over 1,000 combat missions. He had sunk the Soviet battleship Marat with a single bomb. But when he strapped into the Ju-87G for the first time, he found his true calling. Rudel understood the Kanonenvogel in a way few others could. He knew it was slow. He knew it was defenseless. And he knew that hesitation meant death. So he didn't hesitate. His tactics were brutal and direct. He would approach a Soviet tank column at treetop level, hugging the terrain to avoid detection. Soviet gunners often didn't see him until he was already lining up his shot. Then, from less than 800 meters, he would open fire. The first burst was a test, watching where the tracers struck. The second burst was the kill. Rudel aimed for the engine deck or turret ring, where armor was thinnest. A single well-placed shot could cripple a tank. 2 shots could destroy it outright. And then, before Soviet anti-aircraft guns could track him, he was gone, banking hard, skimming over trees, already lining up his next target. He flew mission after mission with relentless focus. He was shot down over 30 times, wounded 5 times, and once had to crash land behind Soviet lines and walk back to German positions on a shattered leg. By the end of the war, Hans Ulrich Rudel had personally destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks. Not damaged, not claimed, destroyed. Confirmed kills, witnessed and recorded in meticulous detail. No other pilot in history, on any side, in any war, has come close to that number. The Ju-87G attracted a particular kind of pilot, men who understood that every mission might be their last, and who flew anyway with grim determination. They were the tank hunters, the men who chose to fight at altitudes where a single mistake meant obliteration. Tactics, the hunt. Flying the Ju-87G was not about speed or agility. It was about patience, precision, and timing. The hunt began long before the cannons ever fired. Kanonenvogel pilots relied on intelligence from the ground, reports from Wehrmacht units, reconnaissance flights, radio intercepts. They needed to know where Soviet armor was massing and when they would be most vulnerable. The attack itself was flown at brutal altitudes, often no higher than 50 meters, sometimes lower. This was below the effective range of most Soviet radar, and it gave the Stuka a fleeting advantage: surprise. Soviet tank columns moved in long lines across the steppes, their crews often riding on the hulls, oblivious to the sky. They had learned to fear German tanks and artillery. But being hunted from above by a lumbering dive bomber armed with cannons seemed absurd, until it wasn't. The first indication was often the sound, a high-pitched scream, as the Stuka's engine roared at full throttle, followed by the hammering roar of the 37mm cannons. By the time Soviet crews realized what was happening, it was too late. Rudel's preferred method was to strike from the rear or side, where armor was weakest. He would fly in low, line up the shot with surgical care, and fire a short, controlled burst. The recoil would slam the aircraft upward. Then he would bank hard, drop even lower, and disappear before Soviet anti-aircraft guns could react. If he missed, there was no second pass. Soviet flak crews were quick and deadly, so every shot had to count. Some pilots attacked in pairs, with one Stuka drawing fire while the other struck from a different angle. Others used terrain, diving from behind ridgelines, striking and vanishing back into cover. But the constant was this: they flew alone, or nearly so. The Luftwaffe could not spare fighter escorts, and so the Kanonenvogel pilots learned to survive on their own, flying low, flying fast, and trusting their instincts. Soviet tank crews quickly learned to fear the silhouette of the Stuka. They posted lookouts. They dispersed their columns. They called in fighters to hunt the tank hunters. And yet, the Kanonenvogel continued to strike, day after day. A slow, grinding war of attrition, where every destroyed tank was a small victory in a conflict that Germany was slowly losing. The cost: no safety, no mercy. The Ju-87G was effective, but it was not safe. For every tank destroyed, there was a price, and that price was paid in blood. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was merciless. The Red Army deployed mobile flak units with every tank column, quad-mounted machine guns, 23mm autocannons, 37mm flat guns on trucks. These weapons turned the sky into a storm of steel. A Stuka flying at 50 meters had nowhere to hide. One well-aimed burst could tear through the cockpit, shred the control surfaces, or ignite the fuel tanks. Pilots who survived often came back with aircraft so riddled with holes that ground crews marveled they had flown at all. And then there were the fighters. Soviet air superiority grew stronger with each passing month. By 1944, the skies belonged to the Red Army. Yak-9s and La-5s prowled the front lines, hunting for slow, vulnerable targets. The Ju-87G was a favorite. When Soviet fighters caught a Kanonenvogel, the outcome was almost inevitable. The rear gunner could do little. The pilot had no chance in a dogfight. Survival depended on getting low, getting fast, and hoping the terrain provided cover. Many didn't make it. Ju-87G units suffered catastrophic losses. Entire squadrons were wiped out in weeks. The life expectancy of a Kanonenvogel pilot was measured in days, not months. Rudel himself was shot down repeatedly. On one mission, anti-aircraft fire forced him to crash land. He and his radio operator spent 3 days evading capture before reaching German lines. On another mission, flak tore through his right leg, shattering the bone. He refused evacuation, continuing to fly missions. Eventually, the leg was amputated below the knee. He flew again within weeks, with a prosthetic. For the men who flew the Ju-87G, there was no illusion of safety. They knew the odds, and yet they flew anyway, because the alternative was watching Soviet tanks roll unchallenged across the front. The Kanonenvogel was not a symbol of strength. It was a symbol of desperation, a last defiant strike against an enemy that could no longer be stopped. Legacy: the end of an era. By 1945, the Ju-87G was a ghost. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Soviet armies were pushing into Germany itself. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, could barely contest the skies. Hans Ulrich Rudel, flew his last mission on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. His war was over. The Ju-87G never saw service again. Most surviving aircraft were scrapped. A few ended up in museums, relics of a brutal conflict, but its legacy endured. The Kanonenvogel proved that dedicated ground attack aircraft, armed with cannons, could be devastatingly effective against armor. This concept influenced post-war designs like the American A-10 Thunderbolt II, a jet-age tank buster built around a massive 30mm rotary cannon. The Ju-87G also represented something darker, the grinding desperation of Germany's final years. It was a weapon born not from triumph, but from the realization that the war was lost. And yet, for the men who flew it, the Kanonenvogel was proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could still strike back. Reflection: the price of desperation. The story of the Ju-87G is not a story of glory. It is a story of adaptation, courage, and the brutal mathematics of war. The Kanonenvogel was never supposed to exist. It was a relic transformed into a predator, an obsolete aircraft given one last chance to prove its worth. And in the hands of pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, it succeeded beyond all expectation. But that success came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of pilots died flying the Ju-87G. Thousands of Soviet tank crewmen perished in its sights, and in the end, it changed nothing. What remains is the memory of the men who flew it. Men who climbed into a slow, vulnerable aircraft, knowing they might not return, and fought anyway. The Ju-87G was the flying tank buster, the Kanonenvogel, the last desperate strike of a dying air force. And in the brutal skies above the Eastern Front, it earned its place in history, not as a symbol of victory, but as a testament to what men will endure when all hope is lost. The Ju-87G was a weapon of desperation, but in the right hands, it became a legend. But what about the tanks it hunted? What about the Soviet armor that rolled across Europe, unstoppable and relentless? Join us next time as we dive into the machines that changed the ground war and the men who fought inside them. If you want to keep exploring the untold stories of history's greatest machines, make sure you subscribe and let us know in the comments which aircraft or tank you'd like us to cover next. Because every machine has a story, and every story carries a lesson.